Today on the LIVEcast, we're talking Cain, Abel, and the culture wars. Hello, welcome to the LIVEcast. My name is Glen, Scrivener, and here from our Eastbourne studios, we're going live with the ever wonderful
Paul Feesey.
Paul
That's
Feesey.
me.
Yep,
P-Fizzle.
There he is. P-Fizzle is in the house, and we are actually live. So how does it feel? Are you nervous?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't know how long it's been since we were last live. We were discussing this earlier, like before you arrived. And I think, was it during actual lockdown?
We did quite a lot of live during actual lockdown.
Over Zoom, we did some live ones then. But
We did one back in September as well. But yeah, we're a bit rusty.
Yeah, absolutely. So
I don't know who's more nervous about misspeaking. Are you more nervous about me misspeaking or more nervous about you misspeaking?
Oh, I'm always nervous of me misspeaking. Who knows what I might say?
Yeah, that is the right answer.
Anything could happen.
So we are talking today about Cain, Abel, and the culture wars, because we're in part of a series called Reset, and we're just noticing that a lot of people are wanting to hit the reset button, having hopefully had the very worst of COVID behind us. Obviously, there's all sorts of shenanigans to navigate moving ahead, but a lot of people are wanting to figure out what is real, what is true, and we want to hit reset by going back to the beginning and figuring out this ancient book of Genesis, our origin story. And part of the thing we're doing in Genesis is we're going back to the beginning backwards. So we start with Genesis 4, and then we'll do 3, 2, 1, all the way back to in the beginning, God. Yeah. So today we're thinking about Cain and Abel. We've had a couple of episodes that have dropped, a couple of interviews, one of which was with Alistair Roberts, and we'll think about him in a second, and another with Miroslav Volf, who we saw on Friday. And we're going to be thinking about whether this very ancient story that people like Jordan Peterson go nuts over, they think it's the most incredible, compelling, explanatory story that you could possibly imagine. We're going to think about whether it can cast some light onto our current culture wars. But before that, we always want to dive down into the mailbag. So, Paul, you took on the task of diving down into YouTube comments.
Reading the YouTube comments, yep.
And you still survived.
Still here, yep.
Yeah.
Not retreated entirely into my
There were
shell.
some nice ones, weren't there?
Yeah, they were. Actually, I was surprised. It was very little abuse. So it's when they hurl a load of abuse at you and then say, yours in Christ.
Yeah. Grace and peace.
Yeah.
Grace and peace.
So we have one comment. These were actually all on last week's LIVEcast, but someone here commented about one of the other videos we'd made, which was the If Phones Were Bibles?
If Phones Were Bibles.
Phones Were Bibles, which was our little sketch, kind of 90-second sketch, illustrating what it would be like if we replaced our phones with our Bible and what life might look like. And someone had just said, I shared the If Bibles Were Phones video with a lot of non-Christians. It's been a great conversation starter with them.
So there you go.
Good to hear. Now, I'd be interested to know, if you're still listening in, what kind of conversations you had.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to know. I mean, I had someone, I shared it, and someone just said, oh, it's really thought-provoking. But they never kind of went any further than that, kind of.
Yes.
I kind of came back and said, oh, yeah, like, it's fascinating when, that this is the amount we use our phones and yada, 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 and so on. And
right.
But I didn't hear any more from them.
Right.
But it'd be interesting to know what conversations you did have and where it went.
Yeah. My favourite moment from the whole thing was actually when our cameraman, our media producer, Max Patterson, was actually the driver.
Yeah.
With the immortal line, mate, were you on your Bible?
Which we could get I think we should get that on a mug.
Mate,
that you can
we on your Bible.
Go and get your merchandise.
Yeah, don't Bible and drive, people. It's very dangerous.
So that was one of our comments. And then again on the LIVEcast video last week. So last week we were talking about the Tom Holland interview. And Tom Holland talked about surrendering to the story. And that's that was the name of the LIVEcast last week. So as he's done his research for Dominion, he's... you asked him, didn't you, where do you kind of stand on these things now? And he said, well, I've kind of lost my faith in... Liberalism, yeah. And he kind of said, maybe slightly cryptically, but surrendering himself to the story.
Yeah.
Even if he might say, I'm not sure...
Yeah.
Did the Exodus happen? That's he said, that kind of
thing. Did Moses part the Red Sea? I don't know. But there's a truth to the story that I'm going to surrender to.
Yeah. So that's kind of what he said. And we were talking about that a little bit. And so we had a comment in last week saying, surrendering to the story presupposes there is something innate within mankind that can surrender. hence a cognitive pathway to God that one can come into alignment with volitionally. But as one is dead in their sins and trespasses, one can't surrender themselves. Do you seriously think Tom Holland's understanding and ruminating like Peterson's or any others has any impact in God's world for anyone? Come on, folks, wakey, wakey. The whole basis of his supposition is dispelled before you got out the gate. God chose that there will be his... he's missed a word. God chose that those will be his before the foundation of the world. And as Christians, we're to stand wherever God has preordained and point to the cross as those who are given to his Son will at some stage in God's timing believe upon the Lord Jesus Christ as their Saviour and Lord. This is already set in stone. It's not something an academic illuminates to anyone or changes the outcome of within society. People just like rubbing around the truth, as I'm sure it heightens book sales along the line. Peterson and Holland always remind me of the Pharisees in the temple, and I always picture Jesus walking towards them in anger and frustration and boomeranging their literature over walls.
Okay.
So I think he liked it.
With boomeranging their literature over walls.
He's going to come back. Yeah.
If Bibles were boomerangs.
Yeah, I mean, this one caught my eye because I don't think we would not deny, would we, that. Of course, God chosen those who will believe before the creation of the world. Does that mean, therefore, that the idea of surrendering to the story or the things that Holland or someone like Peterson are saying just make no difference? So I think the point being made was, look, you can't surrender to the story. You're dead in your sin. You don't have power to surrender yourself to this.
Right.
And of course not. None of us make the decision to become Christians where the Spirit opens our eyes. And we're drawn to the Lord Jesus there. No one comes to me except the one the Father draws.
But how does he draw them?
That is the question, isn't it? So in answer to the question, do you seriously think Tom Holland's understanding and ruminating like Peterson's or any other has any impact in God's world for anyone? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do actually.
Yeah.
I think that it's entirely possible that God may choose someone before creation, and that the means he may use to bring them, maybe they're sitting there thinking, you know what, the Bible's a load of rubbish, don't need to bother with that. Oh, I've just heard of this guy, Jordan Peterson. Oh, it's interesting. He's talking about the Bible as if it's something worth thinking about.
Right.
Tom Holland saying all this stuff. That's it's challenging what I think. Maybe I'll look at this. Maybe I'll pick up a Bible.
Right.
Maybe I'll look at it. And maybe through that they find themselves believing and they go, I think I'm ready to surrender
to
myself
the
to the story. Now of course, none of that takes away from the fact that God called them before the creation of the world.
Right.
Right. And I mean, obviously here he says, God has told us to point to the cross, in order that those who will come will, in their time, come. Which is absolutely fine. And I think in Tom Holland's book, I mean, Peterson perhaps is not so cross-focused at all, but Holland seems very much centered around the idea that it's the crucifixion and what has come from that has been this seismic shock to the world.
Right.
Right.
And he wants to surrender himself to that story. Yeah. So he's quite specific about the story.
So I think it's very. I think that kind of this kind of comment. I mean, you could easily say, couldn't you? Well, if your attitude is, it doesn't make a difference what people do in the world. People who have been called will come. You could almost write off evangelism.
Yes.
Now, I mean, admittedly, it says you're supposed to point people to the cross, but you can just say, well, why bother though?
Yes.
Why point people to the cross if they're going to come anyway?
Yeah.
You can take it. You can almost pull it out of your hands entirely.
It's like kind of zeroing in on Romans 9 and not reading onto Romans 10.
Right.
Romans 9 is the classic text for Calvinists to say, God chooses. And then Romans 10 goes into, but how will they believe unless someone is sent to them?
Sure.
Faith comes by hearing, and hearing via the word of Christ. So, the idea is not that faith comes simply by an arbitrary zapping before the foundation of the world. The Apostle Paul, who's just written Romans 9, he still believes that we need preachers who preach the message, and faith comes by hearing the message, and that's the message of the crucified one.
And of course, even those who don't necessarily explicitly preach the message of the gospel, someone like a Peterson, I mean, we might see later on if we've got time, have become the gateway drug.
Yeah.
Into Christianity for some people.
Yeah, totally.
So
totally.
As they've described it.
So I think there can be a real problem within Reformed circles. So those who are kind of descended from Calvin and his way of thinking. There can be a real problem with evangelism when we think of evangelism as a bit like a barcode reader gun. So the preaching of the gospel is the barcode reader, and all you're doing as a preacher is you just go through the motions, you give a faithful Bible exposition, and what you're really doing is reading the listener, and if they've got the right barcode that's been fitted to them before the foundation of the world, then it goes blip, and if they don't, nothing happens, right?
Sure.
And so sometimes the Bible is powerful, sometimes preaching is effective, and sometimes it's not. All the action happens before the foundation of the world. But I think the picture the Bible gives to us is not that preaching is like the barcode reader gun. It's like preaching is like a magnum. Okay, it's a gun that you actually make your mark with.
I thought you meant the ice log.
It is also sweet and delicious. And taste and see that the magnum is good. But no, it's the gun kind of magnum that actually makes its mark. The gospel, Romans 1 verse 16, the gospel is the power of God for salvation. Which, I don't know, if I translate that into Tom Holland's language, the story has a power to it so powerful that it makes you surrender. This is actually brilliantly reformed language, actually. What can I do except surrender to this greater power that I've recognized in the story? So it seems to me that, you need to hold Romans 9 and Romans 10 together, the way the Apostle Paul does.
Yeah.
But
And the other comment we had in that I thought is really useful for just springboarding us into some thoughts on this. Again, about Tom Holland, someone said, one can acknowledge the cultural importance of Christianity without accepting its mythic element. And then there was a little exchange and they came back in another comment. In any case, it's absurd to think that an idea about how to live or a set of values cannot be understood for their value and then be adopted by rational people without accepting the whole context of how they came about. How can it be possible that we'd be held hostage to myths? Thoughtful people can acknowledge the role of religion played in the coming about of certain ideas or patterns of behaviour which are of value, but can a rational person deny reason and sign up for a mythic explaining of the world? Hard to imagine how it can be done with integrity. And without necessarily diving into the specifics there, I think the interesting thing that comes out of that is maybe two things just to think about is, we might be listening to the Tom Holland stuff maybe as Christians, and we're thinking, it's all good stuff and we enjoyed it and it's, that's great. But in terms of, there will be people, like maybe non-Christians, and we might bring this to them and they just go, okay, yeah, the world, my Western views are built on Christianity. So what? Like, who cares? What am I supposed to do with this? So for us evangelistically, what difference does this make, really?
I think it makes a lot of difference. And one difference that it makes is, here's this guy called Jesus. He grew up as a builder's laborer in some northern backwater of a long-dead empire. He was crucified aged 33 as a blasphemer, according to the Jews, as a rebel against Caesar, according to the Romans. And after 3 years of shooting his mouth off around Palestine, that should have been that for the Jesus movement. And yet, what does he predict? He predicts that his message will be like a mustard seed that grows into the greatest plants in the garden, and even the birds of the, perch in its branches, or it's like yeast that works its way through dough, or he even says, my church will be such a conquering force, not even the gates of hell will prevail against it. And you think, well, who are you? Jesus is the definition of a loser, absolutely crushed by Roman power, and yet 2,000 years later we're saying, turns out it was true. Turns out that like yeast working through a dough, like the mustard seed that grows into the biggest plant, the church has conquered in such a way that even its greatest enemies have ended up on the inside of the church. So, one thing it does is confirm the prophecies of Jesus, who, and you might think, well, okay, so Muhammad had a great influence as well, and so did the Buddha. Well, but the Buddha had a body of teaching and founded a school, and it's not hard to see why the Buddha's teaching became successful. Muhammad had an army behind him. It's not hard to see how his state became successfyou It's really hard to figure out why
crucified, failure in the eyes of the world.
So I often say, I say to people, do you know Jesus' first miracle? It's turning water into wine. And some people have heard of it, some people haven't. I said, water into wine, that's a miracle. But how do you go from crucifixion to world domination? That's a miracle, right? So there's one avenue for discussion. And I think the other avenue that really comes off the back of this question is how can anyone want to deny reason and go for this mythic understanding of the world? Holland's argument is the other way around. Holland's argument is, if you have any kind of Western values whatsoever, if you have any kind of sensibility that the poor and the marginalized should be protected, if you have any kind of sense of human equality or human rights, you already believe in the myth. Like
Right.
the myth.
Sure, yeah.
You're cool on the myth. You've already taken a leap of faith. What you don't have is anything solid under your ground, under your feet.
Yeah, sure.
You've taken a leap of faith. If you believe in human equality, human rights, if you believe in protecting the poor, if you believe that a society should be judged by how it treats its minorities, if you believe in any of these kind of liberal shibboleths that pretty much most people do, unless you really are a far-right kind of Nazi or an eco-fascist or, I don't know, like you've got to be really outside
Yep.
the acceptable bounds of Western society not to believe this stuff. Or you're Yuval Noah Harari, who's just like such a contrarian. He's like, yeah, human rights, forget them. But you're a very strange person in the West not to believe in these sorts of things. You already believe in the myths.
Yeah.
Holland is not telling you to
point.
take a leap of faith. You've taken the leap
taken
of
the leap.
faith.
Yep.
How about having a foundation for it? And here's the foundation for it. Power has come and has earthed itself in history, and power has served the weak and the marginalized. And the reason why we think it is good for the powerful to serve the weak is because the powerful has served the weak. And actually the metaphysical grounding for that is what makes sense of the mythic reality that has come to us down through history. So those are some of the things that I'd say.
And maybe the other side of it then would be like, obviously that has an evangelistic point, but just if you're a Christian who sits there and goes, okay, yeah, but and what does
Yeah.
that mean for me?
I think one of the things it means is in our cultural analysis, what we're looking at when we see the culture wars is not, it's not that there are the forces of light and righteousness and then all the baddies over there. It's every kind of dispute you see in Western society is an intramural dispute, like between factions of the Christian house. And it's like we're hurling Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the verse references. And that is what, that is what our secular society is. So I think it gives you an avenue for looking at the world. And in your evangelism with people who have criticisms of Christianity, to be able to do the whole, that's interesting that you find a problem with whatever, Old Testament wars. You got a problem with Old Testament wars. Why have you got a problem with war? Caesar didn't.
Yeah.
Muhammad didn't.
Sure.
Genghis Khan didn't. Like no empire has ever had a problem with war. I think you've probably learnt that from this guy who says, "Put away your sword, because those who live by the sword will die by the sword." And so in your evangelism, you're equipped to say, you're taking the side of the Sermon on the Mount against the side of Romans 13. That's interesting. We can have a conversation about that. But you're already standing on some Christian foundation, so it helps you with that as well, I hope.
Cool. Yeah, good stuff. Well, that's everything from the mailbag.
That's the mailbag, sewn up for another week.
Keep commenting.
Keep commenting down below, because we love going down and reading the comments. Mostly.
Sometimes.
We've mentioned Jordan Peterson a couple of times. How strange for us to have done so. But this week, he has come back for, I think it's been his first sort of to-camera video. He did a kind of an interview with his
daughter, didn't he?
Yeah. But this is him and his webcam. And we've got a little clip about Jordan Peterson. He's kind of narrating the way in which he's wrestled with this addiction to some medication that he's been on. He's been to all sorts of rehab centers all over the world to try and kick this. And he's been close to death. It's been a real trial. But on the far side of the trial, this is how he signed off the video. Let's have a look.
Anyways, I'm not going to make this a long video. I wanted to tell you that I'm back in Toronto, that I'm in much better health, although it's still severely impaired, especially in the morning. But I can work again, and I really want to. And that to let you know that with God's grace and mercy, I'll be able to start generating original material once again and pick up where I left off. Thank you very much. And well, thank you very much is probably sufficient. Bye-bye.
So, by God's grace and mercy, Peterson is going to continue his work, and his work is going to be looking at Exodus. And while he's waiting to get started with Exodus, he's going to look at Proverbs. So, what does Jordan Peterson want to get back to? And I just find it interesting that having written a global bestseller, surely the thing he wants to get back to is just cranking out the self-help books. And to a degree, he does want to bring out 12 more rules for life. But the thing that seems to be occupying him and interesting him is getting back to the Bible. But then, that final note of by God's grace and mercy, and he even kind of gives a little look up as he says, by God's grace and mercy. I haven't heard him speak like that.
No.
Either the words or the tone of the words. And I don't know, I wonder, and I've been praying as he's been laid low for the last year. I've been praying that he would look to God's grace and mercy quite a bit, because that's not always the tone you get if you just sort of read through 12 Rules for Life, is it?
No, I think we've always kind of said about Peterson that we've always appreciated a lot of the things he said, but we felt that the one thing he never seems to have commented on or really understood is the need for grace. There's always a sense of just sort your ideas, sort out your ideas, clean up your room, bucko, and it's all good. Pull yourself together.
Yeah.
In some ways, very, very Pelagian, maybe.
Right.
Right. And so it's interesting because his health's obviously not been good. I think his wife is very ill.
Yes.
And so it's obviously been a very difficult time. He looks, just looking at him, he looks like he's been through the ringer.
Yes.
And he sounds more subdued in his manner anyway. And it may well be that, through the going down into the depths, maybe the Lord has met him in the depths somewhere in a way that he couldn't meet with him when he was in the heights. Yeah,
when he was marching towards the top of the hill, bearing his own cross. He was once asked in an interview, because he kind of uses that language of you got to take up your cross, take up your suffering, own it, take responsibility, and march up the hill. And people sort of asked, what's at the top of the hill? He's like, I don't know, just just do it,
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see where obviously he says he wants to get dip into Exodus and dip into Proverbs and things. It'll be interesting to see what his next content is that comes out. I imagine he probably wants to do, those things probably won't emerge for a while, I'd have thought, in terms of if he's going to do work on them. But whether he'll be doing more stuff to camera and bits and bobs or any speaking, I don't know. So it'd be interesting just to see what kind of things he starts talking about.
Yes.
Even before he hits that, just to see kind of how these last few months have hit him, really, and what's made him land.
Because I worried for his followers, having read 12 Rules for Life, and he was like, be more lobster, take responsibility, clean up your room. And I kind of thought, that is a great message for people who are just ready to hear it. And they will get their lives together to some degree or another. But 6 months, 18 months down the track, what's it going to be like in 2 years? When you've been as lobster as you can be, and it's still not enough lobster, what then? And I really worried for his followers, little knowing that it's Peterson himself that would fall flat on his face.
I thought that's interesting. I thought you were going to say, like, there were those who are ready, who just needed that push. To say, look, stop sitting around playing video games, man in your 30s, get some responsibility and, do something. And who were that? I thought you were going to say there were those who aren't even at that, who are just so far down.
Yes.
The idea of even getting your life together in some way is so inconceivable.
Right.
And maybe there's nothing there for them really in that message.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably true as well. There's not a lot there for those people, if you've not got get up and go and, you can't pull yourself together. But it is, like you say, that's really interesting, even for those who can.
Yeah.
Where are you in 18 months, 24 months?
Yeah. Which is why the comparison with Russell Brand, I think, is really interesting. And, within 12 months of one another, Brand brought out a book with 12 chapters, and Peterson brought out a book with 12 chapters, and very much Peterson's 12 chapters are rungs of a ladder that will help you to ascend. Brand's 12 chapters, he's written an ode to the 12 steps. He's written an ode to Alcoholics Anonymous and all the other rehab kind of programs that have been spawned by Alcoholics Anonymous. And so chapter 1 for Russell Brand in his great book, Recovery, it's eminently quotable, is looking at step number 1 for an alcoholic who has come to realize that their life has become unmanageable and they have no power to change themselves. That is step 1 of the 12 steps.
Yeah.
It's extraordinarily Christian. I mean, it grew up out of it met in an Anglican church in New York City, and it was founded by a pastor and his friend. And even though it talks about a higher power, the higher power within the 12 steps is very Jesus-y. And the shape of recovery for the 12 steps is very much, you first recognize you're powerless. You first recognize that you are not all the lobster you can be, and you need help, and you need the higher power. Now, as a Christian, I wish they would name the higher power, because actually, sometimes with my Tom Holland goggles on, I kind of look around and I think, yeah, that higher power, that's like, that's Jesus. You're talking about Jesus. Why don't you talk about Jesus? But I think the shape of Russell Brand's self-help is incredibly different to Peterson's self-help. And I think we've got a clip. Do we have a clip of Peterson and Brand? And they had a conversation about 18 months ago, and I thought it brought out very interestingly how Peterson was on the rungs of the ladder trying to climb up, and Brand was more about receiving mercy in the pit. Let's have a look.
I know you're saying all this thing about sort of one of the essential themes, ideas about the Christ myth being, sort of burn away all that cannot be reborn. But bloody hell, mate, in the actual language, all he bangs on about is kindness, kindness, love, love, kindness, kindness, love, love.
Not in Revelation. Not in Revelation. He's a judge in Revelation.
What? And you're still taking that as what? Books beyond the Gospels, you're still taking as the word of Christ?
Well, I'm taking them as part of the entire corpus of the story. I mean, the reason that Jung thought Revelation was appended to the Bible was because the Christ in the Gospels was erred too much, in a sense, on the side of mercy and not enough on the side of judgment. Because here's
discernment
why.
is important.
There's a technical reason, though. It's like,
we don't want a judgmental Jesus.
Well, you don't have a choice, because if you have an ideal, it's a judge. Like, you have an ideal, and there might be an ideal that you have of you. It's simultaneously your judge, because you fall short of it.
I understand this because, funny enough, I was talking to the fellow that taught me meditation yesterday, Bob Roth. So he's a student of the Maharishi, you know that. He said that when Maharishi was asked, what is the one principle, he didn't say kindness or compassion or anything like that. He said discernment. Right. And discernment, which path are we going to follow?
That's
Where is
right.
the attention going?
Yeah.
But
that's judgment. That's why in Revelation, Christ divides the damned from the saved, and most are damned. It's discernment. And what that means in some sense is that there's 100,000 ways to do things wrong and only one way to do them right, or maybe only 5 ways of doing them right. But you know that in your own life, is that there's an infinite number of snares that you can tangle yourself up in. And to find that pathway where everything is balanced, that requires continual discernment and attention. And so you can't have an ideal without it being a judge, and you can't live properly without discernment. But that doesn't mean compassion, and compassion isn't relevant.
So I guess in that, what you see is that Brand and Peterson, just kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, aren't they? Really. So
Totally.
like Brand is very much Mr. Compassion, and compassion is the wrong word, isn't it? Compassion is right for Brand. Not to say that Peterson is not compassionate, but he's very much about the rules and the law, and that side of things. And it's interesting, isn't it, when Brand says, you don't want to judgy Jesus.
You don't want to judge Jesus. Don't want to judge Jesus.
Peterson quite rightly points out, I think, that, well, you've got one. Because if you have a standard that says, do all these really nice, lovely things, you are then judged by that standard, even if it's your own standard or if it's someone else's standard. Yeah. There is a judgment there being drawn, whether you meet that criteria or you fall short of it. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, it's fascinating to hear them talking about those things. Yeah. And of course, Peterson draws out, he talks about Revelation, doesn't he? I mean, in a sense, I'm frustrated that he doesn't say even in the Gospels, Jesus is incredibly about judgment, isn't he?
Right.
More than they say, Jesus talks about hell more than anyone else, isn't it? Or hell and judgment more than
Yeah,
anywhere else
yeah,
in
yeah.
the Bible, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
So
yeah.
it's one of those kind of, I think, classic misreadings, isn't it, of the gospel? Very selective to just say Jesus says lots of nice,
Yeah,
lovey-dovey things.
yeah, yeah.
But even when he does, it sets a judgment, doesn't it?
Right.
Even the lovey-dovey stuff sets a bar.
Right,
So-
right. Yeah, yeah. He even tells a story about a good Samaritan and then says, "Go do likewise."
Yeah.
You know,
Which put it on me. Put it on me.
yeah. But it's a lovely story, and I think the Good Samaritan, you're meant to first of all put yourself in the sandals of the guy left for dead, and then the beautiful stranger, saves you, and through the oil and the wine, which is the spirit and the blood and all that kind of stuff. I think the Good Samaritan is Jesus, but you're first meant to be saved by the beautiful stranger, and then you're meant to go and do likewise.
Yeah.
So there is gospel and there's law, and there's law and there's gospel. And yeah, I think Brandon Peterson Brand's gone with grace, and Peterson's gone with law. I think Christianity says, okay, there is a law above you, and maybe Brand doesn't focus on this because through addiction, he's already come to see that he can't do it. Once you've fallen flat on your face in addiction, you don't need the law to tell you that you're a total failure. You kind of know it.
Yeah.
So Brand does have an idea of what the law does, and it tells you you're not enough and you're powerless. But he, majors on the grace. And Peterson, he talks a lot about law, but he also talks quite a lot about how there's a divine spark within people and this idea of being in the image of God and that kind of, the dignity that we have. So he's got kind of a sense of, but he's very quiet on the grace and heavy on the law. The reverse for Russell Brand. But I'm just fascinated to see what will happen with Peterson.
Yeah.
Now that he's fallen into a pit. Because I don't think his 12 rules are going to get him out of that.
No.
But by God's grace and mercy, he is where he is.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Be interesting. Very exciting.
Interesting. Getting some great comments on the live chat. Thanks so much, guys. Roger Marshall says, I don't understand Holland's conclusion. Does he think that myth, the story which he likes, is not compatible with history, which as a historian he should like? Why not both? Why not have both myth and history? And I think we will see Tom Holland owning more and more the historical nature of the Gospels. I think he kind of, when I asked him about the truth of the story, he sort of said, I don't know whether the parting of the Red Sea really happens. Which, as we noted last week, he knows that's not the center of the Christian story.
Sure.
But he's
the
like...
molten hot core is the crucifixion, as he says.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. So I think he knows where the molten hot core of Christianity lies, and I don't think he'll run away from the historicity of it forever. I don't think you can, because I think it needs to be true at every level. Paul Vanderklay, who will be on Reset later on in the series, he says, if the resurrection is true, it is true at every level of analysis. If the greatest truth is this Christ story, then that story is going to be true at every level of analysis, not just the poetic, not just the mythological, not just the moral, but the metaphysical. And I think that's actually a good way of engaging someone outside the faith who's wondering, can I believe this? Is pointing out the ways in which they're already living out the story. But do you think it's just a story? Don't you think the story weaves itself into, every area of life, even the historical? I think that's the way. That's the way it's going to be.
Yeah.
As Christoph Keating says, Paul Vanderklay has said, Jordan Peterson's anthropology is Augustinian, but his soteriology is Pelagian. What does that mean?
So, we talked about Pelagius earlier, didn't we? We mentioned Pelagius. So I feel like vindicated, like
Yeah.
I said something intelligent. So,
Totally.
And now I'll undo all that. Well, I guess so. So I guess we're talking about Pelagius, this idea that you can, we can be perfect if, we can make ourselves morally virtuous. And Tom picks up on that as well, doesn't he? Tom Holland, because he talked about this in the video.
He did.
About stripping away original sin. So anthropology, yeah. So what do we think, like Augustine, what do we think about the human nature? Do we think actually we're broken and sinful, and therefore there's nothing, in a sense, like we talked about from that comment, we're dead in our trespasses, dead in our sin, and we can do nothing about it. dead people. You know, it's always there's that illustration people sometimes use, don't they? About you're in the sea drowning, and the boat comes and throws you the life ring, and that's like Jesus throwing you the life ring. And I've always kind of said, I get why people use that, but that's not at all the way the Bible talks about where we are in sin. It's more like we're floating face down, dead in the water,
right?
And our body has gone cold, and
right.
rigor mortis has set in, and yet somehow we're dragged out of the water, and someone else brings us to life. There's nothing in us that has done that. Whereas, a kind of Pelagian view is much more, hey, you can...
You need swimming lessons.
Yeah,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I think that's...
Yeah.
That's probably fair.
Yeah, so Peterson's got quite a negative anthropology. He's
quite rightly, eh?
Quite rightly. Yeah. So I think he's learnt from Solzhenitsyn and people like that, the evil of the gulags and the evil of the concentration camp is within me as well. But then kind of the solution is within me as well.
Yeah.
Which is the Pelagian part of his soteriology. Soteriology, a name for salvation, doctrine of salvation. So it's one to keep our eye on, because I think if anything's going to teach us an Augustinian view of everything, it's addiction. Because basically Augustine's view of sin is basically it's addiction. It's what you love that ends up enslaving you. You go after things that are good in their own way, but you love them too much, and then you end up serving them, and you're addicted to them. And what you need is a greater love to win you away from the lesser love. God is the greater love. That's Augustine's whole thing. And I think he speaks into the heart of the addict in a very profound way. Because that is the experience of addiction. I've loved this lesser thing, and it's gotten hold of me, and I'm not big enough. I'm powerless to defeat this thing. Something else needs to captivate me, and it's Jesus Christ. But let's see if Peterson finds that.
Christoph Keating has said, Peterson says humans are fallen and have deep evil in them, but the way to be saved is to sort yourself out. And then he says, but if you're fallen, how do you sort yourself out? And I think that's absolutely right, isn't it? And I think, his message has been incredibly... powerful in this generation, and I think because there's, or at least to my mind, there's been, particularly amongst young men, there's this extended adolescence, where people aren't really growing up or taking responsibility, and to have someone kind of come and say, you know what, you could do it. I can see why that's taken hold, but like you said, where does that leave you 24 months down the road when suddenly you go, well, I've tried to get my stuff together. And you know what? Some of that's okay, and that's worked a little bit, but actually there's still quite a lot of mess here that I don't really know what to do with.
Right.
And I think that's going to be really interesting to see
where
that leads. And so I am excited to see what happens with Peterson, and I hope he's sitting on something that he hasn't brought out to us yet.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Maybe he is. Well, one story he really loves is Cain and Abel. He says it's one of the most profound stories that's ever been told, this ancient story that comes in Genesis chapter 4. And we've done a couple of Reset interviews recently, all about Cain and Abel. We did one with Alistair Roberts, and then last Friday we showed one with Miroslav Volf, the professor of systematic theology at Yale. And let me just read the story, and I think we'll see why it resonates so much with a contemporary audience. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man," or perhaps even more literally, "I have brought forth the Lord man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, but Abel also brought an offering fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted?" Yeah, see, that's why Peterson likes it. But if you do not do what is right, here's a much more Augustinian view, though. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know yet," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So what do you take from this story, Paul?
Yeah.
What are the riches?
Well, I mean, it's one of those stories that like when you read it, it just feels a bit strange, doesn't it, by itself? It's hard to know what to make of it. And I think that's why, particularly the conversation you had with Alistair Roberts, I think was just so enlightening. And if you've not seen that interview, I really recommend you go and watch it. I think it's as I watched it, I thought I need more Alistair Roberts in my life. Basically, I need more of his stuff because it's just excellent. You read the things about well, obviously Cain brings these kind of the crops, and Abel brings the kind of the firstborn stuff, and we kind of already know in our head from our Bible knowledge, we know the significance of kind of firstborns and things like that and things, but it's still, you kind of go, well, what's going on here? And I really thought what was helpful at Alistair Roberts is he talks about almost you work the story backwards. So why is the gift a problem? Well, you see what happens when the gift is rejected, which tells you something about the heart of the gift, what was going on in the heart of Cain when he brought that gift.
Yes.
Which I thought was really interesting.
That's such a good point. Yeah.
Because as you read through, so if you were just reading as you tend to do, you read the story chronologically.
Yeah.
If you were to just stop at that stage and go, what's going on there? I think it would be a struggle to know straight off what's going on. So I think he really helpfully drew that out.
There are some clues about why would Abel's offering be accepted and Cain's not. I mean, one clue is the parallel with Genesis 3. So in Genesis 3, you've got the fall that's kind of a vertical fall, a fall from God. And in Genesis 4, you've kind of got the horizontal fall, the fall from one another. And there's all sorts of parallels between Genesis 3 and Genesis 4. But one thing that happens in Genesis 3 is when they are naked, they atone for one another, they cover one another. It's the same word in Hebrew. They atone for themselves, they cover themselves with vegetation.
Yeah.
And the Lord obviously does not think that their vegetation is a good covering. He makes them skins. So in the next generation, we kind of see this. Abel is going for the blood sacrifice.
How do you appear before the Lord?
Right. How do you cover yourself?
You cover yourself with
blood sacrifice.
Or with the blood
sacrifice.
Fig leaves. Yeah.
Yeah,
and like that came out, I thought that was really interesting as well. I thought it was just a really good observation. And, I think you ask as well in the interview, someone will say, you compare Genesis 3 and the fall and what Adam did to kind of what Cain did. And it just seems a bit of a mismatch, really, about the consequences, because Cain obviously kills his brother, and he kind of just, he just has to go off, and no one's going to kill him. He's going to be okay.
Cain killed a guy. Anchorman reference, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Stabbed in the heart with a trident.
Whereas, Adam and Eve just ate some fruit.
Right.
And I thought what Alistair helpfully pointed out, or brought out, was this idea of that initial disobedience being like a drop of ink landing on that paper that absorbs and begins to spread out. And what we're seeing in those chapters is that spread of sin, how it increases. So, perhaps we're not supposed to look at the sin of taking the fruit as the most despicable thing, in the sense of, is this the greatest moral evil ever that's occurred? Probably not. It's obviously sinful because they're disobeying God, but we're seeing how that therefore leads to this sin, and then we see that start to spread out through the chapters after as well, which I thought was really good.
Yes, Peter Rossi's just said, all sin is deadly, which is true. And I guess the way the Bible shows that, though, is that it begins in seed form, and then it sort of grows from there. It kind of reminds me of in James chapter 4, where it talks about sin when it is full grown leads to death. Where does it say that? I'm not going to find it. Where is it? It's in the Bible somewhere.
Somewhere. Hey, that was a good enough referencing for the writer of Hebrews.
Well, exactly.
Somewhere it's written.
Exactly, exactly. But yeah, it's that idea that in the Bible, sin does start small, which is not to say that it is not wicked. That first sin,
Or less deadly.
We were talking earlier about David when the other kings went off to war. He just took a stroll on his palace rooftop, and then he saw a girl, and then he commanded her to come, and it snowballed, and then the sin of David and Bathsheba, just rolls on down through the centuries in Israel. And you might think, his decision not to go out to war with his generals, a little decision, yeah, it was, but it snowballed, and this is the nature of sin. Christoph says it's in the 67th book of the Bible, the Concordance. Yeah, that's true.
I also thought one of the things that Alistair brought out, which was just really good, was he talked about Adam. Adam and Eve, or Adam kind of as representative, they take the fruit from the tree. And of course, this leads into sin. And then we get into this next chapter and we see how that sin spreads. And, Abel is dead. His blood cries out for vengeance from the ground. And yet we have, Jesus being the one who places himself onto the tree, in contrast to being, them taking the fruit from the tree. And his blood, far from being crying out for vengeance,
right.
It's the very thing that placates judgment and removes guilt and shame. And I thought it's just such a wonderful, way in which he showed how these Old Testament stories, which can sometimes seem a little bit obscure by themselves, are pointing us forward to Jesus.
Yes, I discovered the verse. It wasn't James 4, it was James 1. Right? When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there is that sense of it growing. But not only does sin grow from Genesis 3 and 4, but the redemptive stream kind of grows from Genesis 3 and 4. And it's fascinating to draw all the strands that appear from Genesis 4 to the point where you get to Jesus, and he is his brother's keeper. And he is the firstborn who does take care of his brothers, rather than kill his brothers. He is the offering. And I find it fascinating that in Genesis 4, Abel is the younger, and yet he offers the firstborn. Whereas the firstborn rests on his firstbornness, and he is rejected. So it is actually about trust in the true firstborn who ends up being sacrificed to be his brother's keeper, and his blood cries out for mercy.
Doesn't Alistair say, does he reference Philippians in the talk? Does he say that, Jesus is the one who doesn't cling to...
Yes, doesn't grasp.
But...
empties himself.
All that. And again, just really brilliant parallels drawing out, him drawing those out there.
And with Miroslav Volf, which was the interview you can check out from this Friday, and he, we talk about Cain and Abel and the prodigal son, because doesn't Jesus tell a story where there are two sons?
Yep.
And actually, the two sons are quite like Cain and Abel. There's a more self-righteous one who burns with anger, and then there is the younger brother who ends up being embraced by the father. And the older brother burns all the more in righteous indignation and murderous anger. And kind of what you see with Cain and Abel is basically the prodigal son story without a father. Like, imagine taking the father away from Luke chapter 15. What would happen? You get the two brothers fighting each other. You get war, you get conflict, And then what do we see when we look at the world? What is modern politics? Modern politics is basically the parable of the prodigal son with no father. And there's reds and there's blues and there's left and there's right and there's older brother and there's younger brother. And both of them need the grace of the father, but instead they just fight each other. So the culture wars, I think, are very much examined and explored and shone light on by this story, I think. Because what you have, especially with Cain, is this sense of getting an identity in what I produce, in what I do, in who I am. And then the other guy becomes kind of a threat to me and competition for me. And suddenly there's conflict because, you know, I want to be noticed for who I am, and this guy gets in the way, and you get war. And Miroslav Volf was very eye-opening, really, in talking about how from the former Yugoslavia, where he grew up, he saw armed, hot military conflict. He studies Rwanda in his book, Exclusion and Embrace. But he says it's happening today. And I was really reticent when I was talking to Miroslav Volf. I was kind of like, you know, we don't want to call modern culture wars like what you experienced in the former Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
But he was like, no, it kind of is, which is scary, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of like a hot war, what we're going through at the moment.
Well, easy and you can drift into something.
Yeah, something
Bad.
warmer and
Yeah.
warmer and warmer.
Yeah.
And, you know, and every single US election is the most important in our time. And, you know,
Is that happening soon?
As
Not
you
heard much
know,
about
yeah,
it.
but it is that sense of the ratchet being turned up and up and up. And, you know, 2016 was the most important election ever. Oh, no, sorry, forget that. 2020. No, 2024. There won't be a 2024 if you don't vote the right way in 2020. And it just gets ratcheted up and up and up. Yeah. Yeah, Human has just said, it's the battle of left and right brain hemispheres, which that is interesting. That's kind of that would be a kind of Petersonian take on the older and younger brother. Really, I forget which is the Human. You'll have to tell me which is the left. A left brain person is more
I
mathsy,
can tell you off the top of my head.
and a right brain person is more artsy, maybe,
Yeah, or the other way around.
or the other way around.
Yeah.
But yeah, isn't it interesting that even kind of brain chemistry kind of bears out these types. These great types. But wouldn't it be tragic if it was just war between left and right, between brain hemispheres, between the artsies and the mods and the rockers and all the rest of it? Actually, there is the grace of Jesus who comes to offer you embrace and a place at the feast, not on the basis of what you offer, but on the basis of what he has offered, and you can come home as a friend. That ought to do us, I reckon. Thank you, guys. You're doing very well in the top chat. Sorry we haven't gotten to all your comments, but
good to see people watching it actually, and it's been good to be live again. Actually,
it has been, hasn't it?
It's good to see people contributing, and hopefully we'll be, the more we do this, the more we'll be able to chat backwards and forwards a little bit about what people are saying. So.
Absolutely. So, guys, do stay tuned this Friday. Our Reset interview is with Father John Bear, who is the Professor of Humanities at Aberdeen University. And he's an Orthodox priest, and he really reads Genesis with real profundity, real depth, real clarity. And in particular, brace yourself, because we're going to talk about our mortality. We're going to talk about facing up to death, which, having come through, hopefully coming through the worst of COVID, we've all been given a little bit of a schooling in our own mortality, but we really need to face this issue because I think most of us in the West today think of death as kind of a technical challenge that I'm sure Google will solve in our lifetimes.
There's an app for that. No.
There's probably an app for that. But no, actually, and we need to face up to our mortality, and John Bear gives us some great tools to do that. So stay tuned for that. And how else can people keep in touch, Paul?
You can go follow us on social media. So Facebook, Speak Life UK, same on Twitter and Instagram. So all those kind of major places. Obviously, subscribe on YouTube, or you can go to speaklife.org.uk/sign up, where you can join our email mailing list, where we'll kind of send you an email pretty much weekly, which will just kind of round up all the things that have been going on, any kind of info from us, and all our resources that have come out in those weeks.
Excellent. And we'll turn this into a podcast, which you can get on your favorite podcatcher, wherever you get them. But guys, thank you so much for joining us, and see you again next week.
All the best. Take care.